right, good afternoon and welcome to the City Council study session for May 27th, 2021, 3 p.m. Due to public health concern, this meeting will be held remotely. You may access the meeting by dialing 253-215-8782 and entering the meeting ID 932-1605-6382, or go through the Zoom, and I won't bother reading that. At this time, we'll go ahead and do a call to order roll call. And Councilmember Abersold, I am here present. Councilmember Denson? Here, okay. Councilmember Franich? Not on yet. Councilmember Himes?
Here.
Councilmember Markley?
Here.
Councilmember Rodenberg? Councilmember Rodenberg, can you turn your mic on, please? And maybe adjust your volume, sir. One more time. Not hearing you. But for the purpose of roll call, we will acknowledge that Councilmember Rodenberg is here, is having a little audio issue. And Councilmember Wook has joined us. Councilmember Wook, would you mind signing in?
Yes, I here.
Thank you so much. City Administrator Bob Larson.
I'm here, and I also want to report, if I can, that Councilor Franich will not be able to join us today. He sends his apologies.
Very good, thank you. Assistant City Clerk, Open Government Administrator Josh Stecker.
Here.
Public Works Director Jeff Langhelm.
Here.
Community Development Director Katrina Knudsen.
She is also, Mr. Chair, she advises she will not be able to join us this afternoon either. She'll try to join us a little bit later if she can, but right now she's indisposed.
Very good. From Gordon Thomas Honeywell, Managing Partner Legislative Affairs, Dale Learn.
Here.
From Gordon Thomas Honeywell, Government Affairs Vice President Josh Weiss.
Here.
And from Gordon Thomas Honeywell, Assistant Government Affairs Consultant Annika Vaughn.
Here.
All right, and Councilmember Rodberg, do you want to try to give us an audio check real quick, just to make sure we can hear you? Still not hearing you. Maybe we'll let Josh work with you offline to get that taken care of. At this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to City Administrator Bob Larson for the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the council, and those invited guests. We've got folks here, obviously, from Gordon Thomas Honeywell, and I'd like to acknowledge Dale Learn, Josh Weiss, and Annika Vaughn. And as mentioned earlier this morning, I would like to first recognize Dale Learn. He's got a brief federal update to then be followed by Josh Weiss and Annika on the state legislative update.
Thank you, City Administrator Dale Learn here. Please ask any questions after my brief summary of what's happening on the federal level. As I've mentioned many times, the federal government does a process as far as budgetarily speaking, and it probably normally in an entire calendar year. And with the new administration, we still do not have a full budget from the Biden administration, and parts of it were dropped today, and presumably most of it will be dropped tomorrow for fiscal year 2022. The surface transportation reauthorization, the infrastructure bill is an ongoing negotiation between the new administration and the majority and minority parties in the Congress, with a group of moderates on the Senate side in particular because of their rules. And they're going back and forth and trying to get a top line number for that. That's ongoing as well. The first committee to offer any legislative language on a new infrastructure package was passed out of committee yesterday unanimously out of the Environment and Public Works Committee of the U.S. Senate, which is the committee of one of three that does policy on surface transportation. And they have jurisdiction over the highway and bridge side, which was kind of a modest increase from current law. But that's ongoing, and that should be very interesting to see how that goes. As far as things we've worked on very particular to the city, the Congress for the first time in 10 years, as many of us know, has decided to bring back congressional directed spending with various processes for the members. Every member kind of has a different process in the committees that they have to answer to. Particularly the Appropriations Committee has a process that they have to then answer to them. We submitted a few projects for Congressman Kilmer's process, and we've submitted 5 for Senator Murray's and Senator Cantwell's. Deadline is Tuesday. Most of the projects we came up with in a short time because of just sort of notices and timeframes in which the members want submissions, as well as when then they have to then submit them to the applicable committees. It's pretty tight. And one of the things that all of the members have requested is a number of community support letters. We got a lot of them for our projects. And we're still awaiting the final ones for Cantwell, and we'll submit through hers on Tuesday. The process, and once submission is done, will be the House will likely begin to mark up their bills, their 12 bills that make up the yearly budget, maybe late June at the earliest, in July before they leave for the August recess. The Senate will likely not begin their markup process until after the August recess in September. So that's where we are on that. As far as I think we are getting a fairly good reception. I think our projects are pretty good. However, if the city decides to move forward with this process next year, we'll evaluate what happens over this year's, again, since it's the first time they've done it in 10 years, which has created some confusion, some differing opinions on how to go about it amongst the members of Congress. And we'll just know exactly what they were looking for a little bit better. And if the city and GTH work together to do this next year, we'll likely have a more predictable time frame as far as some time to sort of prepare, which we didn't this year because they brought it back kind of suddenly. And we'll get to know a little bit more about what the various members are looking for and their appetite for types of projects, as well as within the city. I think we'll get a more diverse ability to look at more diverse types of things that the members of Congress and the committees that they have to answer to are looking for. So that's all I have at this moment. Anybody have any questions? I do want to thank Bob and his staff and Jeff in Public Works, as well as Laura, who put together a lot of the letters. And I want to thank them for, in a very tight time frame for these members' requests, getting things together and getting something that's understandable and fits the criteria that each one of these members was looking for, and submitting something that I think will be competitive. And I want to thank them for that.
Councilmember Denson, you have a question?
Well, I just want to echo what Dale just said about our staff working so hard under such tight timelines. And I also wanted to thank Dale and his team. Thank goodness we had you guys with us this year, right when this came up, because I know you guys have worked so hard to get these projects submitted. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Hyams?
Yes, is there any indication of the time frame if it did happen next year, when it would happen? And I guess as a follow-on to that, rather than be in the panic mode, I am assuming we could start pulling together info for what I call placeholders until they really declare what the process is, and then be ready to pounce.
That's a very astute question, council member, with an answer that is I think will satisfy what you're asking. Is yes, we'll then have a year under our belt. Again, there was a 10-year delta where we didn't. And we'll know, how the Congress and the committees looked at it, which might be a little bit different than how they'd done it in, a decade prior. We'll also have a more predictable budget request from the administration, and then we'll also have a time frame from which they'll look for submissions, which will likely be in February or early March, versus this year that was just kind of scattered because it was new to a lot of these new members' offices. I will say one thing that I've noticed is the members again, we'll have to evaluate who wins and who doesn't in this process. And this year, things associated with nonprofits seems to be something a lot of the members, certainly on the House side, they're looking for. Things that happen, human services seems to be a big plus by a lot of the members. But again, we'll evaluate that and have a recommendation on what to look for, in the November, December timeframe. Allow us to sort of evaluate what the city has if they want to move forward in doing it again. And then, that time frame will be February and March to make those submissions and allow us times to get our community support together, as well as ones that will fit what Congress and the committees of jurisdiction are looking for.
Great, thank you.
Welcome. Anything else?
Thank you,
Well,
Mr.
thank
Lerner.
you. Oh, yes,
I said,
Councilmember.
thank you, Mr. Lerner.
you're welcome.
Thanks, Dale.
Welcome.
I guess next up on the agenda is an update from Josh Weiss and Annika Vaughn.
Sure. Thank you, Councilmember Aberswell and members of the council. Nice to see you all. It was interesting having you introduce us with our titles. It made me think to let you know that Annika actually has gotten a promotion. She's now a government affairs consultant, not an assistant government affairs consultant. So that's good news.
I apologize.
And everyone.
Oh, no apology. Just a nice opportunity to highlight her good work.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Annika.
Thank you, everyone. Can you all see this okay? Cool.
Yeah, and so just so you all know that you're all over on the right side of my screen, so I can't look at the presentation and you quite at the same time. So if I'm looking a little off in the distance, that's why. So thanks for the time this evening or afternoon. We're just going to provide our overview of the session. Annika, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. We'll do that general overview. We'll also review for you how you did with your legislative priorities this session. We'll talk about a few other bills of interest that we ended up spending on time for you this session, and then we'll start talking about next steps for 2022. Go ahead, Annika. Also, just at the outset, I'll say that we provided all of this in a pretty comprehensive end of session report in writing that we've sent out to you. And so if you have more questions about any of these details, it's all recorded there and can be referenced. But please do feel free and ask questions anytime throughout the presentation or at the end. Either one's fine with me. You probably, just in terms of context for the session, you probably know some of this. It was the long legislative session, the first year in the biennium, 105 days. This next 2022 session will be the short session of 60 days. The real focus this year was on adopting their 3 significant budgets, which they did successfully and finished on time. The Democrats do hold both the House and the Senate, pretty strong majorities in both chambers, and as well the governor's mansion. Any bills that were introduced this session that didn't pass are still eligible to be considered in the 2022 session. So unfortunately, some of the bills that we had to fight back this year, we think will probably be considered again next year. At the very outset of session, because it was virtual, which is a new experience for all of us. And I think the legislators showed that they actually could conduct a fair amount of business in a virtual environment. At the outset, they did ask their caucuses not to introduce as many bills. So in 2019, you can see there on the slide, there were just over 2,000 bills introduced. This year, there were about 1,500 bills introduced. 2019 being the last long session. 340 passed this year compared to 481 in 2019. The interesting thing to me anyway about that is that the passage rate is pretty much the same, 22-23%. So they passed the same percentage of bills that they generally do. But in terms of raw numbers, there were about a third less bills introduced and passed. Most of those bills, you can see reflecting the strong Democratic majority, most of the bills passed were democratically sponsored. I saw an analysis that one of the media outlets did that showed that I think it was 95%, high 90% of the bills that actually were passed had at least some Republican votes on it. So they didn't necessarily have Republican sponsorship, but some Republicans did jump on board and vote for them. So that 80% number probably gives it a little bit of a more partisan feel than is accurate. Although I will say it was very clear that the Democrats were controlling the agenda this year. I think the right word, whether you agree with it or not, agree with the policy that they passed or not, is the right word is consequential. They passed more big bills than I've ever seen in my career. They passed the capital gains tax, cap and trade bill, low carbon fuel standard bill. They responded to the Blake Supreme Court decision, which we'll talk about a little bit. They just, it's very unusual for them to pass so many bills that were this complex and this difficult. Okay, now I'm ready, Annika. I'll just briefly go over the three budgets. The operating budget, you remember when we were sitting here with you before session, we were saying, you know, don't pursue operating budget funds. The revenues are in the tank. We really shouldn't plan on having any operating budget provided for us. Well, the March revenue forecasts proved that was totally wrong. That state revenues had rebounded. Combined with federal funding, the state had really a lot of money to spend, frankly. The total budget finally is almost $60 billion. And that amounts to a $3.2 billion increase compared to last biennium. The next revenue forecast will be in June. That'll be just a check-in to see if revenues are continuing to grow at that rate. We do know that last month, we get monthly updates from the State Economic and Revenue Forecast Council. Last month's check-in showed during the month of April that revenues were still very, very healthy, coming in still above forecast. Okay, go ahead. The capital budget, I remember encouraging you to submit capital budget projects because this was the big year in the odd numbered years is the big year to get funds from the state capital budget. This year, it was a fairly robust capital budget at $6.3 billion. Again, in comparison to 2019, that was about $5 billion back then. So we've increased, you know, pretty significantly since then. That number, though, does include, you know, $500 million in federal stimulus funding. There were 222 local community projects funded, and that's the category that we often compete in for our local projects. It's somewhat similar to what Dale was talking about with federal earmarks. This is pretty much akin to a federal earmark project process. And they averaged at $725,000 per project. They did leave over $80 million in bond capacity for the supplemental budget. The state capital budget is funded both with cash sources, but also largely with bonds. And so the state bond capacity is related to their overall operating budget and their operating budget resources. So when they issue bonds, they left a little bit of capacity in there for the supplemental budget for items that come forward that they didn't fund in the biennial budget. We can talk about that relative to your capital priorities here towards the end. Okay, go ahead, Annika. The transportation budget was definitely the heaviest hardest hit budget of the three budgets by the pandemic. Toll revenues, as you know from probably you all pay attention to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, which was one of the less impacted toll based facilities in the state. Toll revenues were down across the state. Gas fuel taxes were significantly impacted. On the positive side, from the transportation budget perspective, when Initiative 976 was overturned last fall, that gave the legislature almost $500 million for this biennial budget that they had not planned on having that they could then appropriate. They are still struggling very much with a shortfall in the transportation budget. The supplemental budget that they ended up passing was essentially a keep the lights on budget. A number of connecting Washington projects were pushed out. They were not paused, but they were they won't be getting done as quickly. And in addition, the state was faced not only with COVID, but with the court requirement to be replacing their own culverts. And then there's a lot of pressure across the state, as we're all well aware of, that there are new projects out there that need to be funded. There's also a real big emphasis from the state DOT and from transportation leaders as well to be funding our maintenance of our state highways at a higher level rather than spending so much on new projects. So they did use a fair amount of new federal stimulus dollars to pay for state-owned culverts. And they actually, because of those dollars, have fully accounted for a plan to fix all of the state's culvert obligation with this budget. Go ahead, Annika. There was a lot of conversation, as you know, going into session and throughout session about a new transportation revenue package for all the reasons we talked about before. There's the need for new revenue. They did make a lot of progress, but they didn't get it across the finish line. The Senate put out their Forward Washington package. I think this was the third session in a row that that package has been out. It was revised. Oh yeah, we even say there on the slide, it was put out first in 2019, 2020. So this was 21 was the third year. It was revised and shared twice more this session. I will say that Mayor Kuhn really was a champion this year. I think he testified 3 different times on different revenue packages and different hearings. And as those of you know that have done this before, you know, that can often mean sitting in front of your computer waiting to be called for several hours at a time. So we appreciated that. The House also, for the first time, put out what they called the Miles Ahead Washington Plan. And this was a result of Chair Jake Fye from Tacoma holding listening sessions all through last interim to hear from different stakeholders about what the priorities really should be within their funding scheme. So they did end up releasing the project list and put that on the table. Neither of those packages obviously moved out of their chambers, but they generated a lot of discussion. This was one area where having the virtual session just really slowed them down. They just could not have the kind of closed door, long negotiations with their transportation teams in the same way in a virtual setting. This, you probably read about this in the newspaper, but the 2 carbon bills were explicitly linked to passage of a transportation revenue package. They do, as they pass the legislature, they say that they don't go into effect until the legislature passes a new additive transportation package that includes at least a 5-cent gas tax increase. The governor vetoed those provisions out of those 2 carbon bills. And I am pretty confident that we will see litigation from the legislature challenging on the cap and trade bill that veto. I think the low carbon fuel standard was a little bit more clear cut that that's within his authority. I'm sorry, I have that the other way around. On cap and trade, it was pretty clear that he has that authority, but on low carbon fuel standard, he vetoed less than a full section. And I'm pretty positive that the legislature will bring suit about that. We can talk a little bit more about transportation towards the end here. So Annika, you can go ahead. So in terms of the city's legislative priorities, I think it was a solid legislative session. We didn't knock it out of the park, but we definitely got some singles and scored some runs. We had at least partial success on the 4 areas here, 3 priorities, and then 1 category of additional items. Go ahead, Annika. So on the sports complex, if you recall, we requested a total of $3 million for this project, which was really a sizable request. We asked for $2 million from the local community projects category, which we did not receive, unfortunately. The Washington Wildlife Recreation Program, which we asked $500,000 for, they did not fund that program sufficiently to get to our project. The governor came out originally in December with a really large capital budget. He funded the local parks category much more robustly. Unfortunately, the legislature pared that back. The governor essentially put out a budget that would have borrowed bonding capacity from the next biennium. The legislature did not go along with that strategy. We did, however, there's sufficient money in the Land and Water Conservation Fund to receive that $500,000 request that you had put in. So at least you will be receiving those resources from that. So, you know, I have down here, why not more? Why didn't we get more than $500,000 considering how big the capital budget was? I talked a little bit about it actually was smaller than what the governor originally proposed. The other thing was, and we're continuing to see a lot of pressure in the capital budget for these kinds of projects, but this year, just like we thought, a lot of communities and a lot of advocates anticipated that the operating budget would be really small, and if not cutting, and they did their best to convert operating budget requests into capital budget requests. And so we saw just more capital budget requests than we normally would see, even in a heavy capital budget year. And then just the bottom line is our delegation prioritized other projects within the district. They do have in the local community projects category, they do have the flexibility to prioritize what they want to see funded. We heard this from Representative Caldier when we talked to her during session. Her top priority, I think she was always upfront about this with us, was the fish food bank in Gig Harbor, which received a full appropriation. And that was something that Senator Randall could support as well. So, you know, that really, at the end of the day, those are the reasons why we didn't end up receiving more for the sports complex project. And I think when we talk about next steps, we can come back to that project as well. In the transportation budget, we've been working on highway congestion relief on Highway 16 since 2016. We're now working on implementing the traffic congestion study that we were successful in getting started in 2017. This is the third session that we've asked for funding for these 3 projects and input. We'll watch it widening as a longer term need. And again, all 4 projects are funded in the Senate's proposal. The top 3 were funded in the House proposal. I already mentioned that Mayor Kuhn testified this year, and I know that Councilmember Himes testified last year. I can't remember who it was the year before. Maybe it was Councilmember Himes as well. You know, we're about as well positioned as you can be if the legislature does finally adopt a revenue package. I'm stealing a little bit of my thunder from towards the end of the slide by saying that I think it's really very much up in the air right now whether the legislature comes back this year in a special session to adopt a transportation package. We hear really different things pretty much week to week. 2 weeks ago, all of the focus was on the governor's vetoes. You had moderates in the Senate saying that he had essentially poisoned the well and that the legislature wasn't going to trust negotiating with him anymore. And then last week, we hear some of those same legislators saying that they're having successful conversations about a smaller gas tax package that would be a Democrat-only package. The other thing that is weighing into the timing of whether they come back is what the federal government does with their infrastructure package. But we've also heard state legislators being told that they have been told by their congressional representatives not to wait, that as Dale mentioned, the federal infrastructure conversation is not clear where that's going to land. And so I think the pressure to wait for that package has sort of been relieved from the states with maybe a little bit more incentive. But bottom line here is, you know, we don't know if they're going to come back. If they do come back, I think we're well positioned and we'll just need to be ready to jump on that opportunity when it presents itself. The multifamily tax exemption issue, your goal on this was to ensure that you had access to what is a current local option property tax exemption to provide affordable housing. I think as you remember, the legislature started debating this in 2020. 5287 was introduced this 21 session, and it was negotiated all session long. This was one of the topics that just not only last session, but through this session was up and down like a roller coaster. And if you remember during session, when it was originally introduced, it really would have been administratively hugely burdensome for small cities and just crafted in a way that wouldn't have been that useful. And we actually opposed that bill, even having been at the table trying to negotiate on it. But good news is, and it actually during one version this session, small cities were actually removed from the program as well. But good news, as the bill passed, you actually can utilize the program. there are still a lot of lengthy legislative requirements that you have to satisfy in order to use the program. And the authority expires at the end of 2026, so no new tax credits can be issued after 2026. In the meantime, the Department of Commerce has a study that was funded in the operating budget to look at how well the new tax exemption is working, including how well it's providing affordable housing. And I think all of the stakeholders are feeling like this will lead to another discussion within the next couple of years about whether to extend the program further beyond 2026. So this is a question for the city about whether you have the staff resources to try and weave your way through this pretty complicated program that they've set up now to try and implement it in the city. But if you want to do that, you do have the authority to do so. You can see why we called this one on that intro sheet a partial success. We also had a number of items that were on your policy document, which if you recall, we have your legislative agenda and the top things that we lead with, and then the policy document are things that we will take advantage of if we get the opportunity. The Open Public Meetings Act flexibility was something that we did push on. It did not pass. I thought for sure last year at this time, if you had asked me to handicap, because we were talking about it last year at this time, to handicap what the legislature might do, I thought this would pass, but it did not. I think it just got hung up at the end in the Senate, got all the way over to the Senate Rules Committee. It just needed to come up on the floor for a vote. I think it got hung up on other issues, other bigger issues that they were dealing with. The Main Street program, which we know your downtown association uses very effectively in Gig Harbor, we have as a standing item to support anything we can relating to the Main Street program. They did pass new legislation this year that extends the program for another period of time. It also responds to how the program was impacted by the COVID pandemic. It allows businesses, this is a B&O tax credit program. It allows them to extend their credits that they earned in 2020 into 2021. And it provides additional resources and allows a greater level of tax credits. So this was a really good bill. Again, this is one that the mayor testified on, and we prepared talking points for him and helped him get prepared for that. So we were glad to see this get across the line. We had just tracking what happened with federal funding allocations. Right at the beginning of session, they passed House Bill 1368, which allocated the CARES Act funding. We provided you during that time in our report a detail of where all those dollars went. And then in the operating budget, actually I should say in the operating and capital budgets, the dollars from the American Rescue Plan are distributed. So a total of over $4 billion were provided, but they did set aside $1 billion for future biennium. If I recall correctly, we have until 2024, I think, to spend those dollars. It might be 2024. Okay. So the legislature is putting away a little bit so they can continue to provide resources to programs that are needed later in the pandemic. And then we also have supported over time culvert funding for local culverts. The state, as I mentioned, did fully fund their obligation through federal funding, but the cities have pretty much been directed to the Brian Abbott Fish Barrier Removal Board, which is the state capital budget program that takes, like many of the other grant programs, it takes applications and then ranks them, and then the legislature decides at what level they want to fund the overall program, which is kind of a frustrating outcome, frankly, because the legislature has not been providing nearly enough resources through that program to take care of anywhere close to the statewide obligation that cities and counties have. They did provide an additional $400,000 to complete an statewide inventory of city culverts, which the Association of Washington Cities has been working on. Go ahead, Annika. A lot of work that we do for you is responding to other bills, even when they're not on the policy document, when there's either a big opportunity presented or a big risk presented. The legislature in the middle of session was handed the Blake decision by the Supreme Court, which threw out our criminal possession of our criminal drug possession statute. So basically, simple possession of drugs in the state would have been legal. There was a lot of debate in the legislature about whether to continue with that policy. There was a pretty strong group of legislators that thought that minor drug possession should be legal in the state. There was also a group that wanted to return it to being a felony. 5476 sort of sticks to the middle, makes it a misdemeanor. That only is in place until 2023. The legislature will be coming back to this policy and revisiting it. And also as part of that, they made diversion a requirement. So if someone is picked up for drug possession, they actually don't go into the criminal justice system until their third offense. The legislature did provide funding primarily for additional treatment, outreach, all of those diversion services that you see there. And the counties received some money for all of the individuals that are in jails that are going to need to be resentenced. And then all of them are going to need to have refunds provided for their legal financial obligations that they've paid. What the legislature did not provide funding for is now under this new law, those misdemeanors will be going to city district court rather than to county superior court. So this is really, the legislature did provide, and we have funding unfunded mandates and shared revenues is one of our priorities also. They provided an additional $20 million to cities in the city criminal justice assistance account for the cost of new criminal justice requirements, but they didn't earmark it specifically related to Blake, and we're pretty sure that it's going to be much more than $20 million statewide. The legislature also passed House Bill 1220, which has to do with, originally it was a complete prohibition on cities being able to ban shelters within your limits. Really significant preemption bill. As passed, we were able to get it slightly amended. You have to allow, and there's major distinctions here based on the type of housing, you have to allow transitional and permanent housing in any zone that allows residential or hotels. And then for emergency shelters, emergency housing, temporary, they have to be allowed in any zone with hotels or in a majority of zones that are within 1 mile of transit. So I don't think that this is necessarily a huge issue for the city of Gig Harbor, but it was one of the more dramatic preemption issues that I've seen in working with the legislature. And then finally on this slide, we weighed in for the city on House Bill 1421, which had to do with city utility liens. And basically it did not pass, luckily, but it will be coming back. And it would have, if you allow utility statements to be, or accounts to be registered in a tenant's name as opposed to the landlord property owner's name, it basically said that you couldn't have a lien on the tenant or on the property owner. You could only have a lien on the tenant. So that was obviously problematic. Go ahead. Okay, this is the last slide on other opportunities, and just for your general information, the legislature really spent a lot of time talking about Growth Management Act bills this year. And I'm not going to go through all of these, actually, just given how long I've been talking already, but a number of these issues are coming back either next legislative session or in budget provisos. The only bill on this list that did pass was Senate Bill 5368. And it is a good thing. It gives cities and counties a new tool to accomplish annexations. You now have the authority to enter into an interlocal agreement between the county and the city, agree on what's going to be annexed, where it's going to be annexed, where the lines are going to be, and it does not require a vote of those residents anymore, which I know across the state in different places is a pretty substantial barrier to getting annexations occurred in order to comply with the Growth Management Act. The other thing to note around GMA is that the legislature for the third biennium in a row is funding a task force to bring recommendations back to it on how to improve the GMA, which is pretty amazing considering how much stakeholder time has been spent on this and how little legislative action has actually occurred. And then just a couple of highlights for you on additional budget items. They do provide additional funding this year for the Basic Law Enforcement Academy, 5 additional BLEA classes. They also provide $250,000 for the DNR to provide grants to cities to help with enforcing vessel registration. And I don't know if that's something that the city would be interested in working on, but that would be a tool out there available for you. You can go ahead, Annika. I will also just mention that we didn't know it in the slideshow, but they finally, on the Public Works Assistance account, they are finally not diverting money out of that account to the education account. So they're allowing those funds to build up and be available for grants. That's the first time since the Great Recession that has happened. They also provided an additional $10 million to all cities and counties in marijuana revenue, which is the first time that they have provided the full statutory amount that they're supposed to be providing local governments in marijuana revenue since the since the initiative was passed, sorry. So the legislature did actually take pretty seriously, relative to other sessions, unfunded mandates and providing shared revenues, which was a good thing. In terms of next steps, I already talked about, special session will probably be the next thing that we get engaged in, other than work groups that are going on, and it's still unclear whether that's going to happen. You're probably all aware the Redistricting Commission was appointed by the legislature this year. They're conducting their meetings. They've been ongoing, and they'll be making recommendations back to the legislature in beginning part of the 2022 session for them to implement. We have heard some speculation that the 26th district could be one that could possibly be impacted. The general sense is that districts around the Puget Sound that have been growing robustly are going to get more legislative influence. Their districts will get smaller, and then districts that are maintaining or losing population, their districts will get bigger. They'll lose legislative influence. So we'll just have to see how that goes. We don't know, we haven't been told that the legislature will meet again in person in September and December. They have scheduled legislative committee assembly days. And then in early December, the governor will come out with his proposed supplemental budgets, and then session starts on January 10th again, and do this all over again. So thanks for giving us the opportunity to represent you. I think this is the 14th year we've represented you, and the 3rd session that I've worked with you. So appreciate working with you, and glad that we have some things to feel pretty decent about. And
Anyone have any questions for Josh or Annika? No. Oh, I'm sorry. Councilmember Himes.
Yeah, well, thank you for the show and tell. That was great. Transportation, our favorite topic. We now have words from you that it didn't go that well. We got words coming out of the federal that it ain't gonna. the great Albert or two, and it seems like we're going to have to rethink some of our strategy relative to transportation, and I'm not sure what that consists of. The prioritization thing was a little bit troubling. The way it sounded, our own delegates bailed on us at the end. And don't worry, we'll fix that with redistricting. Anyway, it begs the question: what are the things that we should be doing to get a better batting average? We've been down there multiple times. Our story, people say, yeah, your story is pretty good, but it just seems to me that we need to do something. And for example, the Fish Food Bank is a very worthy cause. But if you look at the other aspect, we've been standing in the line for at least 3 years now. when we were donating the land and a whole bunch of other things for the Fish Food Bank. And it's troubling call. We seem to get aced out at the end, okay? by whoever happens to cut in line with the most popular item of the day. So that's a question called, what are there things that we can do, okay, that give us a shot? For example, should we pare down our list and just make it an all or nothing on one item, okay? One key critical item, okay? Which, by the way, critical meaning it may impact somebody else negatively too, if it doesn't pass, that type of thing. So there's my question.
And I mean, I think my general answer is that there was a lot there, but my general answer is that I think we're doing all of the right things. You know, we have a number of tactics and strategies. We have an approach that we use for other jurisdictions that has been working. We have some particular dynamics with our delegation. It's a little bit hard because, you know, our House members we're in the minority. That's just the reality of the situation. And we have, you know, the 26, there's a couple of other cities and there's, you know, some other organizations there. So you have a challenging environment. I guess that's what I would say. So I don't think we're doing anything wrong per se. And I don't know on transportation specifically. I mean, we're going to know here by the end of the year if they don't do a special session on transportation. I think this is just my prognostication. I think we probably won't see a revenue package for a couple more years. I think that'll go dormant for a bit of time. And they won't do anything until after the 22 election. So maybe in the 23 session. And then who knows what our district looks like and what our political dynamics look like then, right? So, you know, if we don't see anything, maybe in 2022, we have to start thinking about how do we make an ask in the supplemental transportation budget, although the supplemental transportation budget is in the tank. I mean, it's just not healthy at all, even for the size of projects that we're talking about. So, I mean, there's not a whole lot more we can do, right? Those are political legislative leadership questions that no single jurisdiction, let alone every city in the state, saying we need a transportation package is really going to bend the curve on. I don't know in this meeting if you were planning on, the agenda says talking about 2022. And okay, I mean, I've actually had a conversation with Senator Randall already about the sports complex and about, you know, whether or not it would make any sense at all to bring that request back in the supplemental. She hasn't had a chance to talk to her capital budget leadership. This was 3-4 weeks ago that I talked to her. So she didn't have a very definitive answer, but what she did say was there's nothing wrong with that request. She doesn't dislike the request. The delegation doesn't dislike the request. It's not like it's, because that happens sometimes. Jurisdictions can put forward requests and the delegation can be like, I don't think that's important. So that was not the signal from her. And if that is still the city's top capital need, I think that's something that we could consider and talk about. And just to be blunt, I mean, I think it's okay for you all as elected officials to be having those conversations with other elected officials about, okay, it's our turn now. We are tired of not getting our requests funded and we need a turn. But it probably needs to happen at that level. I can only do so much for you on that. So I think that answered your questions, Councilmember Himes, and I'm happy to answer more questions. I'm happy to transition into 2022, however you want to proceed as well.
Thank you.
Any last questions? Councilman Rodenberg?
Yeah, I hope my volume is working now. Is it?
Yes, sir.
Is there a chance we could get this this PowerPoint that you just sent us? There's a couple of slides I'd like to look at more clearly.
I I think they have it, don't they, Josh?
It's part of the packet. It's posted online
Okay,
with the
thank you very
agenda.
much.
Councilmember Himes? Volume?
Yep. You mentioned the climate change issues as part of the GMA. That topic came up in the Pierce County Regional Council meeting I was at last week. And the natives were restless, to put it mildly, called another task, but no budget, no heads, no anything to pull it off. Okay. What's the feeling down in Olympia on this thing? That is this a task, or is this something that's going to be funded?
So both House Bill 1099, which would have added GMA as an element to the comprehensive plan, and House Bill 1117, which would have added salmon recovery as an element to the GMA comprehensive plan. Neither of those passed, but they will be coming back. And so the discussions all session long on both of those bills was around making sure that local governments didn't have to do something without additional resources. Before they died, before they were killed, they both included strong language that said these don't go into effect until there is funding appropriated by the legislature. And at one point in some of the budget proposals, they were showing resources available for local governments. There was an active conversation going on around how do you estimate how much this is going to cost. So I anticipate that will continue to be the discussion. It is worth noting that the Department of Commerce in the budget, relative specifically to climate change, will be putting together a discretionary, non-mandatory model climate change element that local governments can implement if they want to. They were given the resources to do that work, and I think they'll be done with it. I believe it's by 2023. So some of that work is going on, and they were funded to do that work. Some of that work is continuing forward, doesn't have an impact on you yet, but certainly could.
Okay. Was there any discussion as to what level climate change things should be controlled and basically operated on? For example, in the PCRC meeting, every municipality except for maybe Tacoma said we don't have any climate control engineers, scientists, technicians. We don't have any of that. Okay. And there was a strong reaction called, well, why don't we give it back to the county and say, hey, you do it. So I'd be interested, was there any discussion about level of which this would take place?
Yeah, so it did, especially as it originally was introduced, had a pretty prescriptive approach to requiring cities to reduce vehicle miles traveled within their jurisdiction, which got beaten back, right? Because that obviously a city doesn't have really much if any control over vehicle miles traveled. I think there is the desire to have cities be planning their infrastructure in a way going forward such that it is possible for people to drive less that want to and can drive less. So, more bike ped facilities, electric charging stations, those types of mass transit, those types of activities. But yeah, it was a little bit difficult. And that is one thing I should say, sorry to go on, having Department of Commerce that is what Department of Commerce is going to be identifying. What can local governments be doing to contribute to reducing carbon emissions?
Okay, thank you.
Josh, can I just add, I know you mentioned the legislature was waiting or anticipating the federal government working on the infrastructure. I know Councilmember Himes mentioned the federal government when it came to infrastructure. I do anticipate the federal government passing and signing into law a new infrastructure package. We just don't know the breadth and size of that. You know, the new president offered a package that was, you know, in the $2.4 trillion level, then got some blowback from some of the moderates as well as the conservatives in Congress, and submitted another offer for 1.7. Now the moderates in the Senate have now offered one that's a little bit below a billion or around $1 billion. So they're negotiating. I anticipate worst, I mean, not worst case, but sort of the most conservative case would be something on the 30% more than existing programs federally that will be passed. And who knows, it could be something more than that. And with the breadth of it will be what our current federal infrastructure programs with maybe a few additions, as well as maybe bringing in some broadband and other types of federal infrastructure. But we're still in that debate. I do anticipate something will happen. I do think the administration will, if we get post August and there hasn't been significant movement, Congress will use the reconciliation process they have the votes for it, which is a difficult process. One of my best friends is the staff director on the Senate Finance Committee, and procedurally, it's a very difficult legislative approach, but I think they will do that, and we will see something by the end of the year.
Any final questions? All right, I'd like to thank our representatives from Gordon Thomas Honeywell for joining us today. Do we have, I'm sorry, Councilmember Denson.
I'm sorry, was that all we're going to talk about for 2022? I didn't realize we'd gone on to that part of the agenda. Can we chat a little bit more about that?
Certainly.
Okay, so capital budget, we're thinking, I mean, just because we're all here and this is fresh in our minds, I'm sure we'll revisit it before next session. But Josh, you were thinking capital budget for the supplemental, potentially bringing back the sports complex. Is there additional money in the operating budget? And what kind of projects could we propose for that?
I mean, I think, so we were successful, for example, this last session in getting resources for a jurisdiction to provide body cameras. There was a bill passed this year that will require any interrogations with juveniles or any felony arrests to be recorded. It doesn't come out and mandate body cameras, but I think, you know, what you're hearing the sheriffs and police chiefs across the state saying is the only way to practically do that is to have body cameras. So that's an example of an operating budget type of request. I think, I mean, I do think we are where we need to be on transportation. I don't think there's really much rethinking that I would suggest at this point with your request there. I do think there will be some capital opportunity for you. I would not suggest this for other clients just because of the history with the sports complex and where it is, because I don't think there's going to be very much actually available. And then, yeah, and then any other policy bills, you know, policy issues that you want to put forward. I do think, you know, Councilmember Himes mentioned this before. We really recommend that you be targeted and narrow. As you know, I talked about, we end up fighting a whole bunch of bills on your behalf that we don't anticipate, and I think that will still be the case. But being really specific about what you need, I think, is the best. And so I think the best thing that you guys could do is to be, you know, make sure that what your priorities are really well vetted and amongst yourselves and, you know, really ready to go. That whatever we put forward is a really solid request. And I don't want to assume that just because the sports complex is what we've been working on, that is still your highest capital budget need.
Councilmember Denson.
Okay, well then just to the rest of my council members, maybe we can give some thought to some operating things that we want to do that would fit under this for next session.
Councilmember Himes.
I'm back again here. Fish culverts. You mentioned that the monies were somewhat reduced, it sounded like, for 2021. We have a major project that's got a fish culvert tied to it, okay? And the question is, do we see any light in 2022 to get that thing funded, to at least the fish culvert portion of it funded, or some chunk of the fish culvert funded in 2022 moving forward?
And I think the first question the capital budget writers are going to have is, did you, apply through the Brian Abbott Fish Barrier Removal Board process? And so they're going to want you to take that route. If we, do and rank low, then we could start to think creatively about, trying to get an earmark in some other category, some other bucket of money. But right now, the direction they're really pointing you to is that grant program.
Okay. Jeff, do you want to add anything to that relative to the approval?
Well, and I think Councilmember Himes, the culvert project you're referring to is the 96th Street culvert crossing.
Yep.
Yeah. While that is a project that is in our laps today, because it has a failed section, a separated section of the culvert. It's not because it's a high priority project in terms of significant improvements to fish habitat by making it fish passable. I can guarantee you that if we were to look at all of our culverts in the city that we operate and maintain, there are many other culverts that would jump ahead in line in a competitive process to receive funding, because there are other culverts that improve many more acres of fish habitat other than this one. So it would be a challenge to have that one, I think, receive funding through the process, the formal established process.
Okay, thank you.
I should also have mentioned, I talked about the fact that they're not diverting money out of the Public Works Assistance account anymore for education. There will be, and there are resources available for the next grant cycle. I think, if I recall correctly, Jeff, I might be wrong about this, the culverts would be eligible for that, just for, not from a fish perspective, but just from an infrastructure perspective. There is some conversation, this is probably too much in the weeds, but in the Public Works Assistance account is funded partially with a portion of the state's real estate excise tax and a portion of the state's hazardous substance tax. Those streams have been diverted as well since 2010. There is conversation legislatively about putting those resources back into the Public Works Assistance account, which would make it whole finally for the first time. That is a big policy issue that perhaps the city would be interested in. That would be another sort of category of things to think about, Councilmember Denson, as you think about priorities.
And I'd just like to add to council that on June 10th, we're going to be having a study session that will be talking about potential projects the city may apply for that Public Works Assistance, Public Works Trust Fund account. Since it's coming back, there is a very short turnaround time on that, though. We'll be talking about in June 10th, and we need to apply, I believe Trent said, by July 9th. So anyway, very compact time frame, but we will be coming to you with a few projects at the June 10th meeting.
Any last questions? Any?
So
I'm sorry.
we could, Annika and I usually do an interim plan for you. That'll talk about, process and some of the things that we could be engaged in. And, we have in the past gotten together with the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee to talk about a prioritization process or a, teeing up issues. That would be another option too, from a process perspective, if you're interested in that. And I think that's all I have to say.
All right, final opportunities for questions. Going once, twice. We'd like to thank the members of Gordon Thomas Honeywell again Wish them all a
Yeah.
happy Memorial Day weekend. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
We have a
Second.
second. We have a second. All in favor, say aye.
Hi.
Aye. Have a great weekend. Have a great Memorial Day. Thanks to staff. Thanks to everyone else